On the surface, Midwest suburbs still look reassuring. Prices are lower than the coasts, inventory exists, and nothing feels rushed or chaotic. Headlines still use words like stable and affordable. Open houses happen. Agents talk about steady demand. If you scan listings quickly, it's easy to believe these markets are quietly winning. But if you linger a little longer, something doesn't quite line up. Interest shows up, then fades. Buyers tour homes, ask careful questions, and then step back instead of leaning forward. Homes don't fail dramatically. They simply wait. Sellers feel calm, assuming time is neutral, while momentum thins beneath them without making noise. That contradiction is the trap. We're trained to equate affordability with safety. Lower prices feel like protection. If nothing is breaking on the surface, nothing must be breaking underneath. But markets don't turn when prices fall. They turn when behavior changes. And buyer behavior in many Midwest suburbs has already shifted in ways that don't announce themselves. What's happening isn't emotional rejection. Buyers aren't angry, fearful, or panicked. They're disengaging strategically. They're deciding not to decide. They're protecting optionality in places that once felt like easy, obvious choices. That kind of withdrawal doesn't show up in price charts. It shows up in hesitation. If you've been watching closely, you've probably sensed this before you could explain it. Showings without offers. Friendly conversations without follow-through. Interest that feels polite rather than urgent. Nothing screams danger, yet outcomes feel heavier than they should. That tension is information, not noise. The Midwest still looks affordable, but affordability alone no longer closes decisions. Buyers are quietly recalibrating what flexibility, lifestyle, and exit options matter to them. They're not running away. They're stepping back, testing, waiting. And that pause is easy to miss if you're only watching numbers. Seeing this early doesn't make you pessimistic. It makes you observant. Buyer exits don't arrive with headlines. They arrive as silence, patience, and unanswered follow-ups. By the time prices respond, the decision already happened. Subscribe and hit the bell. Buyer exits happen quietly first in these markets today without warning signs. On paper, Midwest suburbs should be winning right now. They offer lower prices, more space, and a slower pace that once felt like relief from overheated coastal markets. Taxes are often lower, commutes are manageable. During the last few years, migration narratives painted these places as the obvious beneficiaries of remote work and affordability fatigue elsewhere. By logic alone, buyers should be lining up. That logic is exactly what's breaking down. Affordability used to function as a shortcut for safety. If a home was cheaper, buyers assumed risk was lower and flexibility was higher. Today, that shortcut no longer works. Buyers aren't comparing sticker prices anymore. They're comparing outcomes. Modern buyers evaluate risk-adjusted livability. They ask how resilient their decision will feel if conditions change. Can they exit without loss if a job shifts? Will demand still exist if rates stay elevated? Does the local economy offer enough optionality if one employer falters? These questions matter more than square footage or monthly payment alone. This creates cognitive dissonance for homeowners. Everything about these suburbs feels like it should attract demand. Yet buyers hesitate. Not because they dislike the homes, but because affordability without adaptability feels fragile. Cheap doesn't feel safe if the path out is unclear. Lower prices can even amplify caution. When something is affordable but slow to move, buyers wonder why. They assume others already evaluated and passed. Time on market reframes value. What once looked like opportunity starts to feel like constraint. Buyers also weigh lifestyle risk differently now. Distance from major job centers, limited rental demand, or narrow buyer pools matter more than before. These factors don't show up in headlines, but they shape confidence. A place can be affordable and still feel risky if future flexibility feels thin. This isn't fear, it's reasoning. Buyers are optimizing for choices, not bargains. They want decisions that remain workable across scenarios, not just attractive today. When affordability isn't paired with liquidity and adaptability, it loses its persuasive power. That's why the Midwest isn't automatically winning. The old assumption was simple. Cheaper equals safer. The new reality is more nuanced. Buyers aren't rejecting these suburbs emotionally. They're evaluating them strategically and walking away quietly when the math doesn't protect their future options. Stay with us. Affordability isn't the advantage it used to be, and that shift is quietly redefining which markets truly feel secure long-term today now. The buyer who once powered Midwest suburbs is quietly gone, not because they disappeared financially, but because the mindset that drove their decisions no longer exists. That older buyer was value-driven, long-term oriented, and conditioned to act with urgency. They believed affordability was fleeting and that waiting carried risk. When they found a home that fit their budget and lifestyle, they moved decisively, trusting time would reward commitment. That buyer was shaped by a different environment. Rates were stable. Job paths felt predictable. Housing felt like a one-way door you stepped through and stayed behind. The Midwest appealed because it offered permanence. You bought, settled, and planned forward. Speed wasn't recklessness. It was responsibility. Today's buyer is built differently. They are flexibility-driven, optionality-focused, and verification-oriented. They don't assume stability. They test it. They don't rush to lock in decisions. They stress test them. Where the old buyer optimized for value over time, the new buyer optimizes for freedom over outcomes. This shift didn't happen because of headlines or mood. It happened through experience. Buyers who moved during earlier migration waves learned something important. Patience worked. They watched listings sit. They saw sellers adjust. They realized waiting didn't punish them. It improved their position. That lesson rewired behavior at a deep level. Once learned, that conditioning doesn't fade quickly. Buyers don't forget that leverage comes from restraint. They don't unlearn that flexibility protects them when conditions shift. Even if rates fall or narratives improve, the memory remains. They know urgency is optional now. This creates discomfort for homeowners. Sellers still expect decisiveness because that's what they remember. They interpret hesitation as lack of interest. In reality, buyers are deeply engaged, just internally. They're verifying assumptions, modeling exits, and protecting optionality before committing emotionally. The old buyer trusted the market to carry them forward. The new buyer trusts themselves to adapt. That's a profound identity shift. It changes how homes are evaluated, how timelines feel, and how risk is perceived. Midwest suburbs feel different through this lens. Not worse, but less certain as long-term anchors. This is why waiting for the old buyer to return is a mistake. That buyer isn't hiding. They evolved. They learned a new rule set that doesn't reward speed, and markets can't force people to forget what worked for them. Understanding this isn't pessimistic, it's clarifying. Buyers aren't rejecting these suburbs emotionally. They're applying a learned discipline that favors flexibility. Until sellers recognize that permanent shift, behavior will continue to feel confusing. Hit the bell. Buyer psychology doesn't reset easily. Midwest sellers are seeing activity and assuming strength, and that assumption feels reasonable until it quietly fails. Showings happen, messages come in, agents report interest, and nothing sounds alarming. Homes feel busy. That busyness gets mistaken for momentum, even though momentum requires commitment, not conversation. Showings without offers are the first silent signal. Buyers walk through, ask smart questions, nod politely, and then disappear. Sellers interpret this as buyers needing time. In reality, it's buyers collecting information without emotional buy-in. Attention no longer equals intent, it equals evaluation. Polite feedback reinforces the illusion. Comments sound positive but vague. Nice layout. Good neighborhood. We're thinking. Courtesy replaces clarity. In low-urgency environments, buyers don't reject homes openly. They disengage quietly. Silence becomes the safest exit. Days on market stretch next, not dramatically, just enough to feel uncomfortable. 10 days becomes 30. 30 becomes 60. Sellers tell themselves the Midwest moves slower anyway, but time carries memory. Each extra week subtly reframes the listing from opportunity to option. Options favor buyers. Late deal failures deepen the confusion. Contracts get signed, optimism rises, and then inspections, appraisals, or financing stall the process. Sellers blame bad luck or picky buyers. Buyers learn caution. Each failed deal trains the next buyer to hesitate longer and negotiate harder. Social proof reverses here. Activity once signaled desirability. Now it signals availability. Buyers assume if a home hasn't moved, someone else already tested it and walked away. Silence becomes information, not reassurance. This is the danger of misreading calm. Sellers wait for rejection that never comes, believing patience protects value. But waiting quietly shifts leverage. Buyers grow more confident delaying. Sellers lose urgency without noticing it happen. None of this feels aggressive. That's why it's effective. The Midwest doesn't produce loud exits. It produces quiet disengagement. Buyers don't announce they're leaving. They simply stop leaning in. What makes this especially tricky for Midwest homeowners is how familiar it feels. These markets were trained to believe steady interest equals safety. When nothing collapses, confidence lingers. But safety now depends on conversion, not comfort. Buyers are not waiting politely. They are reallocating attention elsewhere. Each quiet showing that doesn't convert is a micro-decision against commitment. Those decisions accumulate invisibly. By the time sellers feel pressure, buyers have already moved on emotionally, even if listings remain bookmarked and conversations stay friendly on the surface. That delay costs leverage quietly, because patience on one side slowly becomes power on the other without confrontation, or warning signs appearing anywhere. By the time sellers realize silence wasn't strength, time has already done its work. Choices narrow, adjustments feel heavier. Understanding these signals early doesn't require panic. It requires interpretation. Subscribe. Silence is not demand. Buyers don't leave the Midwest evenly. They leave specific suburban patterns first, and those patterns repeat every cycle because they're structural, not emotional. Long before prices react, buyer behavior concentrates its retreat where flexibility is weakest. Long commute suburbs feel affordable until time becomes the cost. Buyers initially accept distance for space and price, but once urgency fades, commute friction becomes visible. Extra hours on the road stop feeling temporary and start feeling permanent. When buyers imagine 5 or 10 years of that trade-off, patience turns into withdrawal. The home hasn't changed, the tolerance has. Investor-built outer rings are next. These areas expanded quickly, often optimized for volume rather than community depth. When appreciation slows, investors don't negotiate emotionally. They pause. That pause removes demand that once absorbed listings quietly. Owner-occupants sense the shift immediately. They no longer feel protected by momentum. They feel exposed to resale risk, even if prices still look stable. School-dependent value zones follow closely. These suburbs rely heavily on a single narrative. Buy now to secure future advantage. But buyers have become cautious about paying tomorrow's premium today. When enrollment trends soften or taxes rise to support districts, confidence erodes. Buyers question whether the value story still compounds or simply locks them in. When doubt appears, waiting feels safer than committing. Then there are areas experiencing insurance creep, tax reassessments, or HOA expansion. Individually, these costs feel manageable. Collectively, they change the equation. Buyers are no longer just purchasing a home. They're underwriting a long-term cost structure. When that structure feels unpredictable, flexibility matters more than sticker price. Homes become obligations instead of options. Buyers sense these limits intuitively. They picture resale conversations, not just move-in day. They ask who the next buyer would be, what conditions would need to exist, and how easily life changes could be absorbed. When answers feel narrow, enthusiasm fades. This isn't about pessimism or distrust. It's about stress-testing decisions before emotion attaches. Suburbs built on one-dimensional appeal struggle under that scrutiny. Places that require everything to go right lose attention first, while areas offering multiple paths forward keep it. That filtering happens quietly, without announcements, but it reshapes demand faster than pricing models, Because psychology shifts immediately while numbers lag behind behavior. Everyone else still trusts in spreadsheets and headlines that still feel reassuring. What ties these suburbs together isn't decline, it's fragility. Each relies on a narrow value narrative that works only when conditions cooperate. Long commutes require stable schedules. Investor areas require liquidity. School zones require confidence in future payoff. Rising fixed costs require predictability. When any of those assumptions wobble, buyers reassess quietly. This is why exits happen here first. Buyers don't reject these suburbs emotionally. They simply stop prioritizing them. They redirect attention to areas with more adaptability, even if those areas cost more upfront. Price becomes secondary to exit optionality. Sellers often miss this because nothing collapses. Listings still show, prices still hold. But the buyer pool thins selectively. The most flexible buyers leave first, leaving behind those with fewer options. That composition shift changes outcomes later. This pattern isn't new. It shows up before every slowdown. The Midwest doesn't break loudly. It reallocates quietly. Recognizing where buyers disengage first isn't pessimism. It's literacy. Hit the bell. This pattern repeats before every slowdown. Prices in many Midwest suburbs haven't fallen yet, and that fact comforts sellers. It feels like proof that nothing fundamental has changed. But price stability here is misleading, because prices are not the signal buyers watch first. Behavior is, and behavior already moved. One reason prices lag is anchoring. Sellers remember the last strong sale, the neighbor who closed cleanly, the valuation that felt fair. That number becomes identity, not data. Adjusting it feels like admitting something broke, so patience feels safer than action. Waiting preserves dignity, even as leverage quietly shifts. Low distress reinforces that delay. Most Midwest homeowners aren't forced sellers. They have fixed rates, manageable payments, and no urgent need to exit. Without pressure, listings don't collapse. They linger. Sellers interpret this as strength, but buyers interpret it as flexibility. When no one needs to sell, buyers learn they don't need to rush. Comps also look backward. Appraisals rely on closed deals, not hesitant ones. A market can slow for months before the data admits it. By the time lower sales print, behavior already changed. Buyers understand this instinctively. They don't need charts to tell them patience works. They learn it through experience. Seller patience feels rational, but it has a cost. Time becomes the silent variable. Each extra week on market reframes perception. Buyers ask why it hasn't moved, not whether it's valuable. Offers arrive with conditions instead of competition. Negotiations stretch. Leverage drains without price moving a dollar. This is why prices move last. Price cuts are public admissions that belief changed. Sellers resist that moment as long as possible. Meanwhile, buyers quietly adjust strategy. They wait, they compare, they test. They know that when behavior softens, numbers eventually follow. The danger isn't falling prices. It's shrinking options. By the time prices adjust visibly, flexibility is already gone. Sellers who waited feel forced. Buyers feel confirmed. That shift happens calmly, without headlines. Understanding this doesn't require fear. It requires attention. Midwest markets aren't immune. They're simply slower to admit change. Buyers already see the sequence. Sellers who recognize it early keep control. Those who don't discover it later, when choice feels narrower than expected. This gap between behavior and price is where quiet mistakes compound, because waiting feels harmless until it isn't. And by then, the market has already redistributed leverage away from those relying on old signals today. Subscribe. Price follows behavior, always. When buyers quietly step back, it feels like loss to those waiting for noise. But disengagement doesn't remove opportunity. It redistributes it. In slower Midwest suburbs, leverage doesn't vanish. It changes hands. Adaptive sellers feel this first. They stop chasing old signals and start responding to present behavior. Instead of interpreting fewer offers as rejection, they treat it as information. They price for movement, clarify terms, and remove friction early. That realism doesn't weaken their position. It restores trust, and trust is what still closes deals when competition fades. Patient buyers benefit just as much. They're no longer fighting crowds or compressing decisions. They can evaluate calmly, negotiate respectfully, and walk away without consequence. That freedom doesn't come from fear. It comes from optionality. When buyers sense they aren't being rushed, they engage more honestly, and alignment replaces adrenaline. Long-term operators sit between these groups. Investors, relocators, and planners understand that quiet markets reveal structure. They watch what actually closes, not what gets attention. They study where deals fail, not where listings look busy. When urgency leaves, patterns surface. Mispricing becomes visible. Risk becomes measurable. That's when disciplined action feels obvious instead of forced. What connects all of them is composure. Speed stops being impressive. Optimism stops carrying weight. Transparency, documentation, and timing become the new leverage. Deals don't hinge on who moves first, but on who understands conditions best. This shift challenges identity. Many people associate control with action. But in markets like this, control comes from restraint. The calm operator doesn't rush to prove confidence. They let others reveal their assumptions. Silence works for them, not against them. Nothing about this requires prediction. It requires orientation. Buyers stepping away create space, not collapse. That space allows prepared participants to choose rather than react. Those who adapt early don't win by outbidding. They win by staying aligned with reality as it changes. If you recognize this posture in yourself, you're not missing out. You're positioned. You're operating with clarity while others wait for reassurance that never arrives. Stay with us. Clarity is leverage now. In markets like this, the Midwest isn't collapsing and it isn't being abandoned. What's happening is quieter and more important. Buyers aren't running from these suburbs. They're stepping back from assumptions that used to feel safe, automatic, unquestioned, affordability alone, commute tolerance, long-term certainty. Those ideas carried weight for years, and now they're being tested, not rejected. This is why the moment feels confusing. Listings remain, prices look stable, neighborhoods still feel familiar, yet decisions slow, timelines stretch, and commitment thins. That isn't panic, it's recalibration. Buyers are renegotiating the story they tell themselves before they sign anything permanent. Psychological repricing always comes before numerical repricing. The Midwest isn't immune to cycles. It just experiences them differently. Instead of dramatic swings, it absorbs pressure through time, through patience, through buyers quietly choosing not to engage under old terms. Nothing breaks publicly, but leverage shifts privately. That distinction matters. If you're waiting for headlines to validate what you're sensing, you'll always feel late. If you're watching behavior instead of numbers, the pattern is already visible. Buyers don't need prices to fall to gain power. They only need time to work in their favor. And right now, time is doing exactly that. This isn't a verdict on the Midwest, it's an update. These suburbs still offer value, stability, and life quality. But value now has conditions. Buyers want flexibility, exit options, predictable costs, clarity. When those aren't obvious, they pause, not because they hate the market, but because they understand it better than before. I'd encourage you to look at your own suburb with this lens. How long are homes sitting? How do buyers disengage? Where does silence replace urgency? Share what you're seeing because when people compare observations instead of reacting alone, patterns become easier to trust. In the next video, we'll talk about how time eventually forces price, even without panic, headlines, or fear. How markets resolve pressure quietly through patience and positioning. Stay subscribed. This cycle rewards the prepared, especially those willing to observe early, think clearly, and act without noise when assumptions shift. That awareness isn't about prediction or timing a bottom. It's about staying aligned with reality while others wait for permission. Markets don't reward certainty, They reward readiness. And readiness comes from noticing behavior early enough to matter, when choices still feel voluntary, flexible, and fully yours. That difference quietly separates observers from reactors in every cycle, today everywhere.